In 1867, a quiet Missouri town was shaken by something no one could explain. A boy who never laughed, never cried, and never seemed entirely human. By the time the storm passed, 3 people were dead, and the town's darkest mystery was born. Who was Timothy Caldwell, and why did science fail to explain him? The summer of 1867 settled heavy over Sedalia, Missouri, like a thick blanket of dust and heat. The war had been over for only 2 years, but its shadow lingered on every wooden porch, in every empty field, and in the faces of men who had returned changed. The town was small, a scattering of farms and dirt roads, surrounded by endless miles of prairie grass that rippled like waves under the burning sun. Life there was simple: sunrise to sunset work, Sunday church, and gossip that traveled faster than the wind. Nothing ever truly changed in Sedalia until the boy arrived. His name was Timothy Caldwell, and he came to town the way rumors do, quietly at first, then all at once. He was 8 years old, pale as candle wax, with hair the color of corn silk, and eyes so light they looked almost silver in the right light. The few who saw him for the first time said he was polite to the point of strangeness, always "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," always standing a little too straight, speaking a little too carefully. Timothy had been sent to live with his uncle and aunt, Thomas and Sarah Caldwell, after tragedy consumed what was left of his family. His father, William Caldwell, had been a Union soldier, one of the hundreds who never returned from Andersonville prison. His mother, plagued by illness and poverty, died of consumption in a neighbor's barn during the harsh winter of 1865. By spring, there was no one left to care for the boy. Thomas Caldwell was William's older brother, a hard man who had fought his own battles, both in the war and within himself. He was a farmer through and through, broad-shouldered, quiet, with hands cracked from work and eyes dulled by loss. His wife, Sarah, had grown bitter in their childless years. The war had taken too much from them, their youth, their savings, their hope. When the letter came asking if they would take in William's son, Thomas agreed without enthusiasm. "He's blood," he said simply, "and we can use the help." So one April morning, a wagon rattled up the dirt road to the Caldwell farm, carrying a single trunk, a small sack, and a boy who barely spoke. Sarah met him on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, looking him over. "Well, no matter. You'll do what you're told, and we'll get along fine." Timothy nodded. "Yes, Ma'am." Those were his first words in Sedalia. Life on the farm followed its usual rhythm. The boy rose before dawn, fed the livestock, carried water from the well, and helped in the fields. He never complained, never slowed down, and never played. Sarah Caldwell, who had expected defiance or tears from a war orphan, found herself oddly unsettled by his obedience. Sometimes she would watch him from the kitchen window as he moved across the fields. There was something almost mechanical about the way he worked. Methodical, tireless, too precise for a child. He didn't hum or whistle or talk to the animals the way most boys did. He simply worked, as though following some invisible set of instructions. The neighbors began to notice too. Ellen Patterson, whose farm bordered the Caldwell land, often saw Timothy from her porch. "That boy doesn't act right," she told her husband one evening. "He don't fidget, don't laugh, don't even take a rest. Just moves like he's wound up tight." Her husband chuckled and dismissed it. "You're just not used to seeing a boy that behaves." But Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something about Timothy wasn't natural. It wasn't that the boy was cruel or rude. Quite the opposite. He was unfailingly polite, always ready to help, always quiet when spoken to. Yet his politeness felt practiced, rehearsed, like a performance. People said his eyes didn't match his voice. When he smiled, it was only his mouth that moved. His eyes stayed cold and distant, like winter sky over frozen ground. Dr. Samuel Harding, the town's only physician, met Timothy by chance that summer. The doctor was a man of science, educated, skeptical, and known for keeping his distance from superstition. He'd served as a field surgeon during the war and had seen every manner of human suffering. But something about the Caldwell boy stirred unease in him that he couldn't explain. It was market day when their paths first crossed. Thomas had brought the boy into town to help carry supplies. Dr. Harding was standing outside the general store when he saw them pass. The child walked beside his uncle in silence, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. When Thomas stopped to greet the doctor, Timothy simply nodded, his gaze steady and unreadable. Later that evening, Dr. Harding made a brief note in his journal. A habit left over from his medical days encountered the Caldwell boy today. 8 years old, physically healthy, remarkably composed, displays none of the restlessness common in children his age. His eyes, unusually pale blue, seemed to observe rather than engage. Gave me the distinct impression of being studied, as though the subject were the examiner. By midsummer, whispers began to ripple through Sedalia. People talked about strange sounds at night coming from the Caldwell property, animals panicking for no reason, dogs howling at empty fields, cows refusing to graze near the northern fence line. A few dismissed it as coyotes or wind, but others weren't so sure. Sarah Caldwell, though practical and unsentimental, began to feel uneasy in her own home. She noticed the way Timothy always seemed to appear exactly where she didn't expect him. Once, while she was hanging laundry, she turned to find him standing silently behind her, watching the clothes flutter in the wind. She jumped, dropping a sheet. "Good heavens, child! Don't sneak up on people like that." "I wasn't sneaking," he said calmly. "I was just listening." "Listening to what?" she asked, though she already regretted it. "The wind," he said. "It sounds different before something dies." Sarah told herself it was just a strange comment from a lonely boy. But that night one of their hens was found dead in the coop. No marks, no blood, just lifeless. Then another. Within a week, half the flock was gone. Thomas blamed disease. "We'll burn the coop and start over," he said gruffly. But Dr. Harding, called in to examine the animals, found nothing. No infection, no injuries, no sign of poison. He made another note in his journal. "The deaths on the Caldwell farm are inexplicable. The boy was present during examination, calm, curious, perhaps too curious, asked whether chickens can feel fear before they die." As the weeks passed, Timothy became a fixture in every whispered conversation in Sedalia. The Pattersons' horses refused to approach the fence when the boy was nearby. The Millers swore they saw him standing at the edge of their field at dusk, staring at the horizon as though waiting for something. When asked about his past, Timothy gave answers that seemed true, but incomplete. He spoke of his parents with perfect composure. His father had been a brave man who never came home. His mother, a gentle woman who coughed a lot. He never cried, never asked questions about them, and never mentioned missing them. Sarah Caldwell tried to be patient. She even took him to church, hoping that faith might reach where affection could not. But Timothy's presence unsettled the congregation. During hymns, he stood perfectly still, lips unmoving, eyes fixed on the stained glass window depicting Christ blessing the children. When asked later what he thought of the service, Timothy said only, "I don't think he looks at everyone the same way." By late August, the summer air had grown thick with tension. The neighbors avoided the Caldwell property after sunset. Even the mail carrier refused to linger. Inside the farmhouse, Thomas grew short-tempered, Sarah grew anxious, and Timothy remained unchanged, silent, obedient, distant. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Sarah found Timothy sitting alone by the window, staring into the darkening fields. Lightning flashed, illuminating his pale face. "You should be in bed," she told him. "I can't sleep when the wind sounds like that," he said softly. "Like what?" He turned toward her, and for the briefest moment there was something almost ancient in his eyes, like it's looking for someone. Sarah told herself it was just a child's imagination, but that night she dreamed of empty fields filled with whispering voices. When she woke, the rooster had stopped crowing, and the silence outside the farmhouse was so deep it felt alive. That was the summer Sedalia changed forever. The summer an 8-year-old boy came to live among them, and nothing, not the farm, not the animals, not even the air itself, ever felt right again. And though the townspeople didn't know it yet, the name Timothy Caldwell was about to become one of the darkest legends in Missouri's history. The deaths began quietly, almost like nature whispering a warning no one wanted to hear. The first was a chicken, found by Sarah Caldwell early one morning when she went to collect eggs. It lay stiff beside the nesting box, its eyes open, beak slightly parted as if caught in surprise. There was no blood, no struggle, no mark of violence, just stillness. She sighed, assuming it was sickness or age, but the next morning there were 3 more. By the end of the week, nearly half the flock was gone. Thomas Caldwell buried them behind the barn, muttering about infection and bad luck. "It happens," he said, though his voice held less conviction each time. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The animals had been healthy. She'd fed them herself, checked their water, cleaned the coop. There was no sign of illness, no weakness, no strange behavior. They'd gone to sleep alive and never woken up. Timothy had helped bury them, silent and efficient, never once asking why. He handled the small bodies carefully, lining them up before lowering them into the shallow pit. Sarah noticed the way he looked at them, not with sadness, not even curiosity, but with a kind of detached focus, as if he were taking mental notes on the way their wings folded or how light their bodies felt once life had left them. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind scrape against the windows. Thomas slept beside her, snoring lightly, exhausted from another long day in the fields. But she kept hearing faint sounds outside, the creak of the barn door, a rustle near the chicken coop. Finally she rose, threw a shawl over her shoulders, and stepped outside with a lantern. The yard was empty. Only the long grass swayed in the wind. She turned to head back in when she saw him, Timothy, standing barefoot near the fence line, his nightshirt fluttering in the breeze. The lantern light caught his pale face, expressionless as ever. "Timothy?" she called softly. "What on earth are you doing out here?" He didn't turn right away. When he finally did, his voice was calm, almost absent. "I heard them." "Heard what?" she asked. "The animals," he said. They stopped breathing all at once. Sarah froze. Her fingers tightened on the lantern handle. "You were dreaming, child. Go back to bed." He nodded obediently and walked past her toward the house. But as he passed, she thought she heard him whisper something else, something too faint to be sure. "They don't dream anymore." The next morning, one of the calves was found dead near the creek, healthy the day before, strong and playful. Now motionless, eyes open, tongue grey and dry. Thomas cursed under his breath and sent for Dr. Harding. Dr. Samuel Harding arrived by horseback that afternoon, his satchel of instruments swinging from the saddle. He was known for his composure, but even he frowned at what he saw. The animal showed no signs of disease or injury. The heart had stopped suddenly, as if commanded. He cut a small incision along the chest, inspecting the lungs, the organs, everything. "Nothing was abnormal. I can't explain it," he told Thomas quietly. "It's as if life simply left." Sarah stood nearby, wringing her hands. "Could it be some poison? Something in the water?" "I tested it," Harding said. "Pure as rain." When the doctor turned, he noticed Timothy standing a few paces behind them, watching with that same quiet attentiveness that had unsettled him since their first meeting. The boy's eyes were fixed not on the animal, but on the doctor's hands, studying every motion, every cut, every probe of the instrument. "You're curious, aren't you, Timothy?" Harding asked gently. "Yes, sir. What is it you're curious about?" The boy blinked slowly. "I wanted to see where it went." "Where what went?" "The life," he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Harding's hand froze mid-motion. He said nothing more, But that night he made another entry in his journal. The Caldwell boy continues to display unnerving calm around death. His questions suggest an awareness of life's cessation beyond his years. I cannot decide whether to attribute this to trauma, intellect, or something far stranger. By the end of July, the strange occurrences had spread beyond the Caldwell property. The Patterson's mule was found lying cold in the field, its body unmarked. The miller's cow gave birth to a stillborn calf, though she had shown no complications. And always, it seemed, Timothy was nearby, helping, watching, appearing as if summoned by tragedy. Ellen Patterson began to speak more openly about her suspicions. She claimed the chickens on her land refused to cross near the Caldwell fence whenever Timothy was in sight. "Animals know," she said to anyone who'd listen at the market. "They always know." Most dismissed her talk as superstition, the kind of fear small towns fall into when coincidence turns cruel. But Dr. Harding didn't dismiss it. He began visiting the Caldwell farm more frequently under the pretense of routine medical checks. Each time Timothy greeted him politely, eyes bright, manner perfectly composed. Yet something beneath that composure gnawed at the doctor. Once, while examining Thomas's injured hand from a farming accident, Harding caught Timothy watching from the doorway. The boy's gaze never wavered. Finally, the doctor spoke without looking up. "Curiosity again, Timothy?" "Yes, sir," the boy answered. "I was thinking how much blood is inside before it stops," Sarah gasped. "Timothy!" The boy blinked, confused by her tone. "I didn't mean anything bad," he said. "I just wanted to know how you tell when someone's finished using it." That night, Sarah begged Thomas to send the boy away. "He's not right," she whispered. "There's something wrong in him, something cold." Thomas shook his head. "He's just a child who's seen too much death. The war did worse to grown men, but deep down, even Thomas couldn't explain the way the boy seemed untouched by everything around him. The sickness of the animals, the grief of the neighbors, even the heavy air of fear that hung over the house like smoke. The breaking point came one sweltering afternoon when the sun refused to give mercy. Thomas had gone into town, leaving Sarah and Timothy alone on the farm. She was washing linens when she noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow stillness that comes before something happens. The wind had died. Even the cicadas had stopped their droning. She stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron. The barn door stood open, swaying slightly. Inside, the air smelled wrong, like metal and damp earth. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when she saw it. Every animal inside, the cow, the piglets, even the barn cats, lay still. Not sleeping, gone. Their bodies were untouched, but the barn was deathly quiet. Her breath caught in her throat, and standing in the middle of it all was Timothy, motionless, staring at the ground. "Timothy," she cried. "What have you done?" He turned slowly, his face pale, his voice steady. "They're quiet now," he said. "They were afraid." Sarah stumbled back, nearly dropping her washcloth. "Afraid of what?" The boy looked at her then, truly looked, his light eyes reflecting the lantern glow. "Me, I think." When Thomas returned that evening, Sarah was sitting on the porch, trembling. She told him everything. The dead animals, the way the boy had stood there like a statue. Thomas stormed into the barn, found the lifeless bodies, and for the first time had no words. They buried the animals behind the field, far from the well, and said nothing to the neighbors. But word spread anyway. People began crossing the road to avoid the Caldwell property. Some whispered that the farm was cursed. Others said the boy had brought something back with him from the war, something not human. Dr. Harding visited once more before autumn, finding Thomas distant, Sarah hollow-eyed, and Timothy as calm as ever. As the doctor prepared to leave, Timothy approached him quietly. "Will the animals come back?" he asked. "No, Timothy," Harding said carefully. "When things die, they don't return." The boy nodded slowly. "I know," he said, "but sometimes I feel them watching. It's like they're still here, waiting to understand why." The doctor mounted his horse, uneasy. As he rode away, he glanced back toward the farmhouse. The setting sun cast long shadows across the fields. and for just a second he thought he saw the boy standing in the doorway, hands clasped, face expressionless. And behind him, in the dim light of the barn, something moved. That night, Harding wrote another note in his journal. "I fear coincidence no longer explains what I have seen. Whatever haunts that farm is not disease or madness. It centers around the boy, calm, emotionless, and unknowable. Nature recoils from him, and reason falters in his presence." And so, as the summer of 1867 began to fade, the quiet town of Sedalia found itself holding its breath, waiting for whatever came next. Because death, once it had visited the Caldwell farm, didn't seem ready to leave. The summer of 1867 had turned unbearable. The heat rolled over the town of Sedalia like a heavy blanket that refused to lift. The air itself felt sick, thick with humidity and silence. Even the insects seemed too tired to sing. The creeks that once gurgled happily behind the farms now moved lazily, the water warm to the touch. Yet it wasn't just the heat that weighed on the townsfolk. It was fear, a kind that crept in quietly and refused to leave. By mid-August, the strange occurrences on the Caldwell farm had become the kind of story people whispered about at church or while fetching water, careful not to say too much in case the wrong ears were listening. The livestock deaths, the uneasy quiet, the strange behavior of young Timothy, all of it had left the townspeople uneasy. Still, no one dared accuse an orphaned child outright. Instead, they chose to pray, to gossip, and to stay away. It was on one of those stifling afternoons that Mary Fletcher, the blacksmith's daughter, disappeared. Mary was a lively 5-year-old with tangled red hair and a laugh that could be heard halfway across the square. She was the kind of child who found joy in everything. The flutter of a butterfly, the sound of rain on the roof, the shimmer of sunlight on creek water. Her parents adored her, their only child after years of trying. That morning, her mother had sent her to play near the backfield while she tended the laundry. The creek ran just beyond the willows, a place Mary loved. It was shallow there, safe or so. Everyone believed. When the sun began to set and Mary hadn't returned, her mother called for her from the porch, her voice echoing across the fields. No answer. She walked to the edge of the property, heart beginning to race. Still no sign. By the time the first lanterns were lit in the neighboring homes, panic had spread. Word reached the Caldwell farm, just as Thomas and Sarah were finishing supper. Sarah gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "The Fletcher girl?" she whispered. "No, not her." Timothy, who'd been eating quietly, looked up. "I can help find her," he said simply. Thomas frowned. "It's dark, son. Best to stay inside." But Timothy stood anyway, eyes fixed on the window, as though he could already see something beyond the darkness. "She's near the water," he murmured. "I can feel it." Without waiting for permission, he walked out into the night barefoot, disappearing beyond the fence line before Thomas could stop him. The search lasted hours. Dozens of townsfolk fanned out with torches and dogs, shouting Mary's name into the dark. The creek was searched again and again. Dr. Harding was among them, his lantern cutting through the trees like a dim star. But the night gave them nothing, only the sound of insects and the distant croak of frogs. Just as despair began to take hold, a small figure appeared at the edge of the search party. It was Timothy. His clothes were wet, clinging to his thin frame. His feet were coated in mud. "Mrs. Fletcher," he called softly, his voice barely louder than the crickets. "I found her." Every head turned. Mrs. Fletcher stumbled forward, lantern shaking in her hands. "Where, Timothy? Where is she?" His eyes flickered toward the direction of the creek. "By the bend," he said. "Near the willow tree." They ran. And there she was, Mary Fletcher, lying face down in the shallow water, her small arms limp at her sides. The water was barely a foot deep. She could have stood up easily if she'd wanted to. Dr. Harding waded in first, turning her over gently. Her skin was cold, her lips blue. He checked for a pulse, but there was none. Mrs. Fletcher's scream echoed through the valley like the wail of something ancient and broken. Timothy stood at the edge of the creek, watching silently as they pulled her body from the water. His face was calm, too calm. When Mrs. Fletcher fell to her knees sobbing, the boy didn't move. Not until Dr. Harding approached him and said softly, "You did the right thing telling us, Timothy. How did you find her?" He hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I heard her." "Heard her?" "Yes," he said. "She was calling my name," the doctor frowned. "From the creek?" Timothy nodded. She said she was cold, but there had been no voice, no sound except the rushing water and the cries of the searchers. Harding made note of it in his mind, saying nothing more. At the funeral, the entire town gathered. The air smelled of lilies and rain. The coffin was small, painfully small, resting under the oak tree behind the church. Mrs. Fletcher wept openly, her husband standing motionless beside her, his large hands trembling. Timothy stood a few paces away from the crowd, his head bowed, eyes hidden under his messy brown hair. When the service ended, he stepped forward and placed a single daisy on the coffin. "I wish I could have found her sooner," he said quietly. His voice was so soft, so sincere, that for a moment everyone around him felt a pang of sympathy. But Mrs. Patterson, who stood near the back, later told Sarah Caldwell she'd noticed something others hadn't: Timothy's face. "He wasn't sad," she whispered. "He looked curious, like he was watching how everyone reacted." That night, as thunder rolled in from the west, Dr. Harding sat at his desk by candlelight and opened his journal again. His pen scratched the page with urgency. The death of young Mary Fletcher cannot be explained by natural means. The water was shallow, the child healthy. No sign of struggle. Timothy Caldwell's involvement cannot be ignored. He claims to have heard her call to him, though she had been dead for hours before he arrived. There is something in this boy's manner that defies logic. I've begun to fear not for his safety, but for ours. Across town, the Fletchers buried their daughter beneath the willow by the creek. Mrs. Fletcher refused to sleep for days. She told her husband that sometimes, in the still of the night, she could hear splashing, soft, rhythmic, as though someone were playing in the water again. When she went out to look, the creek was empty. Only the wind moved through the trees. But one night she saw a figure there, a small, thin silhouette standing ankle-deep in the water. Her heart leapt. "Mary," she whispered. But as she stepped closer, the lantern light revealed not red hair, but brown. It was Timothy. He turned when she called his name, startled, as though caught doing something he shouldn't. "What are you doing here, boy?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He looked down at the rippling water. "She's still here," he said softly. "She doesn't know she's gone." Mrs. Fletcher dropped her lantern, the flame sputtering out in the wet grass. "Don't you ever come back here again," she shouted, running back toward her house. The next morning, she told her husband what she'd seen, but he dismissed it as grief. "The boy's odd, yes," he said, "but he means no harm." But deep down, she knew what she'd seen wasn't grief or imagination. There had been something in Timothy's eyes that night, something hollow, distant and knowing. Within days, word spread again through Sedalia. The whispers returned, thicker than ever. Children were kept indoors after sunset. Men carried lanterns and rifles when walking past the Caldwell property. Even Thomas Caldwell began to avoid his nephew's gaze. Sarah, meanwhile, had grown pale and frail. She rarely spoke now, and when she did, it was only to pray. Sometimes she'd wake screaming, claiming she heard a girl's laughter by the window, a soft, bubbling laugh that faded into the night air. Dr. Harding visited again, this time not as a physician, but as a man desperate for understanding. He questioned Timothy gently, sitting with him under the old oak tree behind the farmhouse. "Do you remember what you heard by the creek, Timothy?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." "What did she say?" He tilted his head slightly, thinking. "She said it wasn't my fault." "But I think it was." The doctor's pen stilled. "Why would you say that?" "Because she followed me," the boy replied. "I didn't ask her to. She just did." Harding didn't press further. He closed his notebook, his hands shaking slightly. There was nothing more he could say. The boy's words were too calm, too certain. And the more he looked into Timothy's clear blue eyes, the more he felt as though he was staring into something ancient, something that didn't belong to the fragile world of men. That night, Harding packed his journal and left town for a few days, needing distance. But even miles away, he couldn't shake the sound of the boy's voice, echoing in his head. She doesn't know she's gone. And back in Sedalia, as the storm clouds gathered over the horizon, the wind carried with it the faintest whisper of water, moving where no water should. It was the sound of the creek, and somewhere in its depths, something waited, silent, patient, and unfinished. The leaves had begun to turn brown when the next tragedy struck Sedalia. The air smelled of rain and decay, that in-between season when summer's heat gives way to autumn's chill, and the land itself seems to hold its breath. The Caldwell farm looked the same from the outside. Quiet fields, smoke rising from the chimney, the slow creak of the barn door in the wind. But inside the walls of that farmhouse, something had changed. Sarah Caldwell had stopped eating. She slept only in fragments, murmuring prayers through the night. Thomas tried to stay strong, pretending life went on as usual, but even he couldn't ignore the way the neighbors avoided their road now. When he went into town for supplies, conversation stopped when he entered. People looked at him with pity and something else, fear. And then there was Timothy. He never seemed to notice the whispers. He still worked from sunrise to sunset, tending the fields and feeding the animals. But more than once, Thomas caught him standing at the edge of the property, staring toward Devil's Bluff, the rocky ridge that overlooked the creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned. It was a jagged, lonely place where the wind whistled through cracks in the stone, like a cry that couldn't escape. On the morning of September 3rd, 1867, an old man named Henrik Larsen didn't return from his usual trip to the bluff. Henrik was a Norwegian immigrant who had lived alone for years in a small cabin near the woods. The townsfolk called him Bee-Man because he tended several wild hives built into the cliffside. Every week he climbed the narrow path up Devil's Bluff to check on them, humming old Nordic songs as he worked. That afternoon, a young farmhand spotted Timothy walking alone down the main road toward town. His clothes were dusty, and he carried something in his hand, an old felt hat. When Dr. Harding saw him near the general store, he called out, "Timothy! Where are you off to?" The boy looked up, expression unreadable. "I was looking for Mr. Larsen," he said. "I found his hat by the bluff." The doctor's stomach tightened. "You're sure it was his?" Timothy nodded. "It had his initials." "I think he fell." Within the hour, several men gathered and followed Timothy to the site. The path wound up through tangled brush and sharp rocks, slick from the morning rain. The higher they climbed, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of boots on stone and the occasional scrape of metal against rock. At the base of the bluff, they found him. Henrik Larsen lay twisted on the ground, his body broken in ways too cruel to describe. His neck bent sharply to one side, his arms sprawled unnaturally. His face was peaceful, eyes half open as if caught mid-thought. Around him buzzed dozens of dead bees, scattered like grains of gold on the dirt. Dr. Harding knelt beside the body, his trained hands already assessing. "He fell from the top," he said quietly. "Instant death." But as he looked closer, something didn't fit. The rocks showed no signs of disturbance. No drag marks, no broken brush from a fall. It was as if the old man had simply dropped from the sky. And those bees, why were there so many and why here? Thomas Caldwell crossed himself. "Lord have mercy." Timothy stood a few feet away, watching. His small, pale face was calm, almost serene. "He was talking to them," he said suddenly. Harding looked up. "Talking to whom?" "The bees," Timothy replied. Before he fell, several men exchanged uneasy glances. "You saw him?" Harding asked carefully. "Yes," the boy said. "He was standing up there. I waved." He waved back. Then he started swatting at the air. Then he fell. Dr. Harding scribbled notes in his journal later that evening, trying to make sense of it. "The child's account is plausible," he wrote, "but troubling. There is no sign the bees were disturbed at the top of the bluff. The hives remain untouched, yet many dead bees were found near the body. It is as though they gathered around him only after death." 2 days later, the funeral was held in the small churchyard. Fewer people attended this one. Some said the air in town felt wrong since the last death. Others whispered that the Caldwell boy brought bad luck wherever he went. Timothy stood in the back again, his hands folded, his eyes downcast. But this time, Dr. Harding didn't watch the mourners, he watched the boy. He noticed that Timothy never blinked during the service, never looked away from the casket. And when the final prayer ended, he whispered something under his breath, a phrase the doctor couldn't quite catch. That night, the wind howled through Sedalia like an angry spirit. Windows rattled. Barn doors creaked open on their own. The animals grew restless again. Mrs. Patterson swore she heard a swarm of bees buzzing outside her window, though when her husband checked, there was nothing there. Dr. Harding couldn't sleep. He sat by his desk, reading and rereading his notes. His candle flickered low, casting long shadows across the pages. "Something unnatural ties these events together," he wrote. "The drownings, the animals, now the fall. There is intelligence behind it, or intention. But from where?" He thought of Timothy's eyes, those cold, intelligent eyes that seemed too old for his years. Every time the boy spoke, it was measured, deliberate, as if he were observing the world rather than belonging to it. The next morning, Harding rode to the Caldwell farm. Thomas greeted him at the door, his face lined with exhaustion. "If you've come to ask about the boy," he said, "you'd better speak to him yourself. He's out by the barn." Timothy was there, kneeling beside a broken fence, fixing it piece by piece. The doctor approached quietly. "Timothy," he began, "I wanted to talk to you about Mr. Larson." The boy didn't look up. "He wasn't afraid when he fell," he said softly. Harding paused. "What makes you say that?" "Because he was smiling." The doctor felt the chill crawl up his neck. "Did you see that yourself?" Timothy nodded once. "People think falling is scary. But it isn't. It's quiet. Like going to sleep." Harding stepped back, shaken. "Timothy, how do you know that?" The boy's gaze finally lifted, and for a heartbeat, Harding wished he hadn't asked. Those pale blue eyes caught the morning light like glass, reflecting nothing. "I just do," he said. The doctor returned to town, his thoughts in turmoil. For the first time, he considered writing to a colleague in St. Louis, someone who might help him understand the strange psychology of this child. But before he could send the letter, another knock came at his door. It was Mrs. Patterson. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "Doctor," she whispered, "you have to make him stop." "Stop what?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the dark road. "He's been walking through the fields at night," she said. "Talking to someone. But there's no one there," Harding frowned. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I saw him 2 nights ago. The moon was bright. He stood near my chicken coop, whispering. Then he turned and looked straight at me. "Doctor," he smiled, but his mouth didn't move. His eyes did. Harding's pulse quickened. "His eyes?" "They glowed," she whispered, trembling. Just for a second, like the reflection in a mirror. He didn't believe her, not entirely, but a part of him didn't disbelieve either. He knew madness could spread through small towns faster than any disease. Fear could twist people's memories, make them see things that weren't there. Still, there had been something in her eyes that told him she wasn't lying. That evening, Harding returned to the bluff one last time. The sun had set, the air cool and damp. He climbed slowly, the rocks slick under his boots. The top was silent, except for the low hum of bees. They moved lazily around their hives, unbothered. Then he saw it, a small wooden figure lying near the edge of the cliff. It was carved crudely, but he recognized it instantly. A little man, arms outstretched, face marked with tiny scratches. Someone had gouged its eyes out. Harding picked it up carefully. The wood was warm to the touch. He turned toward the trail and froze. A small figure stood among the trees below, watching him. Timothy. The boy didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared, his face unreadable. "Timothy?" the doctor called softly. "What are you doing here?" The boy tilted his head, his expression calm. "They're not angry anymore," he said. "Who?" "The bees," he said. "They understand now." Before Harding could respond, Timothy turned and walked away. disappearing into the forest like a shadow swallowed by dusk. The doctor stood there for a long time, listening to the fading hum of the hives. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had just ended, and something far worse had begun. When he finally descended the bluff, he felt the first drops of rain on his hands, each one cold as stone. He looked down at the wooden figure in his palm. Its tiny mouth was carved into a faint, crooked smile, and though the wind howled through the trees, the bees stayed silent. The morning after the storm, the town was hushed in a way that felt unnatural. The air hung heavy, with the smell of wet earth and burnt wood. The Caldwell farmhouse, once standing proud against the flat horizon, was now a splintered ruin. The roof had collapsed inward, smoke still curling up from the blackened timbers. Only the stone chimney remained standing, like a grave marker for everything that had been lost. When the first neighbors arrived, led by Thomas's friend Henry Patterson, they expected to find signs of the family somewhere, perhaps taking shelter in the barn or down in the storm cellar. But the barn door was hanging open, the animals gone or dead, and the cellar was empty. It was Henry who found the first body, Sarah Caldwell, lying face down near the remains of the porch. Her hands were covered in soot, and her dress was torn. Her expression, frozen in terror, said more than any words could. Thomas's body was found a few yards away near the well. His face was turned toward the sky, eyes open wide, and though his body bore no wounds, his mouth was filled with dirt, as if he'd tried to scream and the earth itself had silenced him. The doctor, Samuel Harding, arrived later that afternoon, summoned from town by Henry's frantic wife. When he saw what remained of the Caldwell property, his heart sank. He'd seen death before, seen men torn apart by cannon fire and disease, but this was different. This felt deliberate, but where was the boy? Maybe he ran, someone whispered. Maybe he's out there somewhere. Yet when Harding called for Timothy, his voice echoing across the soaked fields, no answer came. They searched the property for hours, the neighbors moving in grim silence through the wreckage. They found Timothy's small shoes, neatly placed by his bedside, untouched. His blanket was folded with care. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. Near sunset, as the last light began to fade, Henry noticed something strange by the well. The old wooden cover had been torn loose, and muddy footprints, small ones, circled its edge. A chill rippled through him. He called for the doctor. Together they peered down into the darkness. The air rising from the well was damp and cold, carrying the faintest smell of decay. Harding lit a lantern and lowered it slowly, the rope creaking as the light descended into the abyss. The circle of flickering light revealed nothing at first, just slick stones and murky water below. Then as the lantern swayed, its glow caught on something pale, floating just beneath the surface. Harding's breath caught. He pulled the lantern up and his voice came out low, trembling. "We'll need a rope." It took 3 men to haul the small body up. The waterlogged form of Timothy Caldwell lay motionless in the grass, his pale hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes closed as though he were merely sleeping. There was no sign of struggle, no bruises, no wounds, just a stillness so profound that it silenced everyone who stood around him. Sarah's sister, who'd come from town upon hearing the news, covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "Oh, poor child. He must have fallen," but Harding didn't speak. He knelt beside the boy and studied his face. Even in death, there was something unnatural about Timothy. His skin was too cold, even for a corpse. The doctor's hands shook slightly as he reached into the boy's small fist, which was clenched tight against his chest. Inside was a single object, a tiny metal locket. When Harding opened it, he found 2 miniature portraits, one of Timothy's mother, faded and worn, and the other unmistakably of himself. The doctor froze. He had never given his photograph to anyone, and yet there it was, his likeness, painted perfectly in miniature, sealed in a locket that should have been decades old. How is that possible?" he whispered, his pulse quickening. No one answered. The others had begun to back away, muttering prayers under their breath. Even hardened men who had seen war refused to look too long at the boy's body. Something in the air felt wrong, heavy, as though the world itself held its breath. That night Dr. Harding couldn't sleep. He sat alone in his study, the storm lantern flickering beside him, the locket on the desk like an accusation. He tried to reason it out. Perhaps he'd been mistaken. Perhaps the likeness was coincidence. But the deeper he thought, the more the details refused to align. He remembered the questions Timothy had asked him weeks earlier about time, about how long a soul remembers. He remembered the way the boy had watched him, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the knowing of someone far older. At midnight, Harding opened his journal and began to write, though his hand trembled the whole time. The Caldwell tragedy defies explanation. The fire left no clear cause, no accelerant, no lightning strike. The boy's body showed no evidence of drowning, lungs free of water though found submerged. The locket! I cannot account for it. The miniature is exact, painted in a style at least 50 years old. I'm haunted by the thought that the boy was not of this time, nor of this world as we understand it. He paused, listening. The wind outside whispered against the shutters, and somewhere far off a dog began to howl. Weeks passed, and Sedalia tried to move on. The Caldwell property was left abandoned. No one would buy the land. People said strange lights were seen there at night, that the well would sometimes bubble even on still days, and that if you stood close enough, you could hear a child's voice whispering your name. Harding, who had once dismissed such stories, found himself avoiding that part of the road altogether. Then, one autumn morning, a letter arrived at his doorstep. There was no return address, only his name written in neat, precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, slightly yellowed. The message was brief. The wind sounds different before something dies. Harding's hand went cold. He had not spoken those words aloud since the night Sarah told him the story. His eyes darted to the window, to the fields beyond, and for a moment he thought he saw a small figure standing near the tree line. A boy with pale hair, watching, but when he blinked, the figure was gone. The doctor left Sedalia the following spring. He sold his practice, packed his journals, and disappeared into the east. Those who knew him said he became obsessed with unexplained phenomena, psychic research, mesmerism, and the study of what he called non-linear consciousness. In one of his later letters, found years after his death, he wrote, "The boy was not a mystery of medicine, but of existence itself. I've come to believe he was never born in the ordinary sense, but manifested, perhaps drawn to tragedy or the echoes of human grief. What science cannot explain, time will remember. The ruins of the Caldwell farm eventually faded into the earth. Grass grew over the stones, the well filled with rainwater, and the story became a whispered legend passed down through generations. Locals still warn travelers not to linger near the old property after dark. Children dare each other to toss pebbles into the well, claiming that if you listen closely, you can hear the splash. And then, faintly, a second splash, as though something deep below threw the pebble back. In the county records, the Caldwell fire remains unsolved. No cause determined, no official explanation. But every few years, when a storm breaks over the prairie, the townsfolk say the wind carries a strange sound, a child's laugh, soft and distant, like an echo from another time. Some say Timothy Caldwell was simply a boy, lost to misfortune, swallowed by the tragedies of an unforgiving age. Others believe he was something else entirely, a reflection of human sorrow made flesh, an echo that slipped through the cracks of time. But no one ever truly forgot him, even now. If you walk the old Caldwell Road on a summer evening, when the air is heavy and the cicadas fall silent, you might catch a glimpse of silver eyes in the fading light, watching from the tall grass. And though you'll tell yourself it's just the wind or a trick of the dusk, a small voice inside will whisper the truth you won't admit. Some mysteries were never meant for science to explain. More than a century has passed since the strange case of Timothy Caldwell, yet his story still whispers through the cracks of Missouri's forgotten past. Was he a child born of darkness, or a mirror reflecting the fears of a broken world? Some questions, it seems, were never meant to be answered. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because we're just getting started. Every week, we uncover true stories buried in history, tales of mystery, fear, and the unexplained that will make you question everything you thought you knew. And tell us in the comments, what do you think Timothy really was? A misunderstood child, or something beyond human? Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and never stop searching for the truth.